there's an old white lady.
On that right here?
You have your cover bag?
There is still someone with a gun.
She's inside.
Okay.
Where? Bro, where? Ex-military. She's in that house, bro. That apartment. Right here. This first apartment. I need like a 49.
Baby, wake up!
That was right there.
Wake up! Wake up! Wake up! Baby, wake up! Baby, wake up! Baby, wake up!
We need to do CPR real quick.
Baby, wake up!
CPR.
Baby, wake up!
Do we have any calls? Do we have any calls? We got a call! We got a call! I'm in front. All right. Sheriff's office, come outside with your hands up! This is the Marion County Sheriff's Office, come outside with your hands up! Show me your hands! Show me your hands! Turn around! Turn around! Where's your gun at? You got hands? We got hands? You're gonna be detained. Is there anybody else in the house? No, not right now. You're not under arrest, you're being detained. Come over here.
The door was locked. The deadbolt was secure. A metal barrier separated two women. One standing outside, angry and demanding answers. The other standing inside, gun in hand. And then, in less than 20 seconds, a single bullet tore through that door. 35-year-old Ajike Owens stumbled backward onto the grass, a hole in her chest, her children screaming. Inside, Susan Lorincz lowered her weapon and reached for her phone to call 911 for the second time that night. But here's what the investigators would soon discover. This wasn't self-defense. This was something much darker, something that had been building for years in a quiet Florida neighborhood, fueled by complaints, recordings, and a hatred that Susan tried to disguise as fear. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why Susan Lorincz is now serving 25 years in prison, and you'll be left with one haunting question that nobody can answer. Stay with me. June 2nd, 2023, Ocala, Florida, 9 o'clock at night. The 911 operator's line lights up. The voice on the other end is frantic, breathless, barely coherent. I just shot someone. She was trying to break down my door. She was going to kill me. Susan Lorincz, 58 years old, living alone in a modest apartment on Southwest 107th Lane. By the time police arrive, Ajike Owens is lying in the grass, bleeding out from a single gunshot wound to her chest. Her children are surrounding her, hysterical, watching their mother die. Susan, meanwhile, is inside her apartment, completely calm by the time deputies knock on her door, cool as a cucumber, as one officer would later describe it. She's already crafted her narrative. She was the victim. She fired in self-defense. Ajike Owens was a threat, but over the next several days, as detectives interview neighbors, review surveillance footage, and piece together the timeline, a very different picture emerges. This wasn't a woman protecting herself from an intruder. This was a woman who had been waiting for an excuse. To understand what happened on June 2nd, you have to understand who Susan Lorincz was. Susan was born on July 23, 1964. The details of her early life are murky, fragmented. She claimed she was sexually assaulted and beaten by a family member repeatedly. Between the ages of 4 and 20, she grew up, by her account, in a conservative household, a household that was hostile toward diversity, hostile toward change. Whether that trauma shaped her, or whether she was simply using it to justify her behavior, we may never know. But one thing is clear: Susan Lorincz grew into an adult who saw herself as perpetually victimized by the world around her. She mentioned having a PhD, though the subject remains unclear. She worked for United Healthcare for a time, but wasn't working by the time of the shooting. She was seeking disability, living alone, isolated, reclusive. Her neighbors described her as stubborn, quick-tempered, hostile, especially toward children. And here's where things get darker. In August 2024, just over a year after the shooting, Susan's sister, Ellen Lorincz, was arrested and charged with child neglect. Police had been called to her home multiple times. Reports of a 9-year-old boy left alone, no food, no medication. 2 sisters, both with a disturbing disregard for the well-being of children. What happened to them? What shaped their psychology? We don't know, but the pattern is unmistakable. Susan Lorincz didn't just dislike children, she seemed to despise them. In 2020, Susan moved into the apartment on Southwest 107th Lane. Across the street lived the Owens family. Ajike Owens, who went by AJ, was a 35-year-old mother of 4. Her children were active, loud, playful, everything you'd expect from kids growing up in a suburban neighborhood. And that's when the problems started. Neighbors reported that Susan became fixated on the Owens children. She would record them, yell at them, call them racial slurs. She filed noise complaints. She called 911 repeatedly. The local officers became so familiar with her that they recognized her voice before she even gave her name. In every interview, in every interaction, Susan referred to her neighbor as Ajike, not Ajike, Ajike, even after being corrected, even after being told how to pronounce her name. It was a small thing, maybe, but it revealed something, a complete lack of respect, a refusal to see Ajike Owens as a human being worthy of basic courtesy. Susan Lorincz had become the neighborhood Karen, and if you don't know what that means, Merriam-Webster defines a Karen as a slang term used to describe a stereotypically middle-class, middle-aged white woman who rebukes or reports others in angry, sometimes racist public displays. Susan fit that description perfectly. Now, let's pause for a moment and talk about something important. Living in a residential neighborhood means compromise. It means accepting that you are not alone, that other people exist around you, that children will play, that families will gather, that life will be loud sometimes. Susan Lorincz chose to live in a neighborhood full of families, and then she spent years punishing those families for existing. She didn't put up soundproof curtains. She didn't invest in noise-canceling headphones. She didn't politely ask the children to keep it down. She escalated. She provoked. She called the police. And eventually, she grabbed a gun. Think about the psychology at play here. Susan had options, reasonable options. She could have moved to a quieter location. She could have taken steps to soundproof her apartment. She could have approached the Owens family early on with kindness, but she chose none of those paths. Instead, she chose confrontation. She chose to position herself as a victim under siege. She chose to view children, literal children, as enemies who needed to be controlled, punished, and ultimately, in her mind, eliminated as threats. This is the mindset of someone who doesn't just want peace and quiet. This is someone who wants power, someone who believes that their discomfort gives them the right to dictate how others live their lives. Here's where the story takes a turn, because what happened on June 2nd wasn't just about noise complaints. It was about control, about power, about a woman who believed the world should bend to her will. That evening, Susan had already confronted the children outside her apartment. There was a dispute over a tablet. One of the kids said Susan took it. Susan denied it. The truth, we'll never know for sure, but what we do know is this. Susan went outside. She picked up a roller skate, and she threw it at one of the children. She claimed she didn't throw it at them, just threw it, but one of the kids said it hit them. Then she grabbed an umbrella, and she swung it at them. She claimed she just brought the umbrella outside because she thought it was raining, because apparently, standing at an open door, you can't tell if it's raining or not. The children ran. They told their mother, and Ajike Owens did what any parent would do. She went to confront the woman who had just attacked her kids. Now, imagine you're a parent. Your neighbor has just thrown an object at your child, swung an umbrella at them. Your child is upset, maybe hurt. What do? Most reasonable people would go talk to the neighbor, try to resolve the situation. Maybe things would get heated, maybe voices would be raised, but that's what adults do. They talk, they work it out. Susan Lorincz didn't see it that way. To her, Ajike Owens wasn't a concerned mother. She was a threat, an aggressor, an enemy. Susan called 911 at 8:54 p.m. She reported that the children were threatening her, that they were trespassing. An officer was dispatched, but here's what Susan didn't tell the operator. She had already attacked those children. She had already escalated the situation, and when Ajike Owens arrived at her door, angry, demanding answers, Susan had already made her decision. She retrieved her handgun, and she fired a single shot through the door. Let's stop here for a moment, because this is the point where everything changes. This is the moment that separates a heated argument from a homicide. Susan Lorincz fired that gun without knowing who was on the other side of the door. She heard Ajike's voice, but she didn't look through the peephole. She didn't verify the threat. She didn't consider that there might be children standing there, that there might be other neighbors trying to intervene, that the police officer she had just called might be approaching. She just fired, and the bullet hit Ajike Owens directly in the chest, center mass, exactly where you'd expect the bullet to hit if you aimed at someone standing on the other side of a door. Susan would later claim she only wanted to scare Ajike, that she didn't mean to kill her, but she had been to the shooting range. She had practiced. She knew how to use that weapon, and she fired at the exact height and position where a person would be standing. This wasn't a warning shot. This was a kill shot. Here's something most people don't understand about firearms. When you take shooting lessons, when you practice at a range, you're taught specific principles. Aim center mass. Control your breathing. Squeeze, don't pull. Never point a weapon at anything you don't intend to destroy. Susan knew these principles. She had been preparing to get her concealed carry permit. She understood gun safety. She understood lethality. So when she says she only meant to scare Ajike, she's lying. Because if you want to scare someone, you fire into the ceiling. You fire into the ground. You fire away from where a human being would be standing. Susan aimed directly at chest height through a door. She knew someone was standing behind, and she pulled the trigger. That's not a warning. That's an execution. Ajike Owens stumbled backward. Her son was standing right there, watching. She collapsed onto the grass. Paramedics arrived. They rushed her to the hospital. She died from her wound inside her apartment. Susan Lorincz called 911 again. And here's where things get truly disturbing, because even in that moment, even after shooting her neighbor, Susan wasn't focused on what she'd done. She was focused on insulting Ajike. On the 911 call, she referred to her as that woman. She complained about the noise. She made snide comments. There was no remorse, no panic about taking a life, just irritation that her evening had been disrupted. By the time deputies arrived, Susan was calm, composed. She told them she fired in self-defense, that Ajike was trying to break down her door, that she feared for her life. But the deputies had already started talking to witnesses, and none of their stories matched Susan's. One neighbor who called 911 after hearing the gunshot described Susan as crazy, that she had been harassing the children for years, that everyone in the neighborhood knew about her behavior. This wasn't an isolated incident. This wasn't a good person having a bad day. This was the culmination of years of hostility, resentment, and unchecked rage. Over the next several days, detectives conducted interviews. They spoke to neighbors. They reviewed surveillance footage. They examined the timeline of 911 calls. And slowly, carefully, they dismantled Susan's story. Neighbors reported that they heard no threats from Ajike, no screaming about killing Susan, no prolonged banging on the door, just a brief confrontation, maybe 20 seconds, And then the gunshot. Susan had claimed that Ajike pounded on her door for 5 minutes, that she threatened to kill her repeatedly, that she tried to break down the door so hard the entire house shook. Detectives went back to the scene. They tried to recreate it. They pounded on the door. The house, built of solid cinder block, didn't shake, not even a little. Susan's timeline didn't add up either. She said she called 911 to report the children, then waited about 10 minutes before Ajike arrived, that there were 5 minutes of pounding and threats before she fired. But the 911 records told a different story. Susan called at 8:54 p.m. That call ended at 8:59. Ajike arrived about 1 minute later. The conflict lasted roughly 20 seconds. Susan called 911 again at 9:01. 2 minutes. That's all it was. 2 minutes from the end of the first call to the moment she pulled the trigger. There was no time for repeated threats, no time to search for her phone, no time to consider her options. Susan had made her decision almost immediately. And here's another crucial detail. Susan claimed she couldn't find her phone after Ajike started banging on the door, that she wanted to call 911 but couldn't locate it. But after the shooting, she found that phone immediately, dialed 911 without hesitation. No searching, no fumbling, just instant access. That inconsistency told investigators everything they needed to know. Susan wasn't panicked. She wasn't frantically trying to call for help. She was executing a plan. Here's where the twist comes, the moment that changes everything. Investigators discovered that just before the shooting, Susan Lorincz had searched for information about stand your ground laws, Florida's self-defense statute, the legal justification she would need if she ever pulled that trigger. And during her interviews with detectives, Susan used specific language, phrases like reasonable and prudent, the exact wording found in stand your ground legal descriptions. This wasn't a panicked reaction. This wasn't a split-second decision made in fear. This was premeditated. Susan had been preparing. She had been researching. She had been waiting for a moment when she could use that gun and claim it was justified. And when Ajike Owens showed up at her door, angry about her children being attacked, Susan saw her opportunity. Think about what that means. Susan didn't just happen to have a gun nearby. She didn't just happen to react out of fear. She had spent time, possibly days or weeks, researching the exact legal framework she would need to avoid prosecution. She had familiarized herself with the language. She had studied the precedents. She had been planning this. Maybe not the specific moment, maybe not the specific person, but she had been preparing herself mentally and legally for the day when she could pull that trigger and walk away justified. That's not self-defense. That's premeditation. Detectives brought Susan back in for a second interview. By this point, they had the evidence. They had the timeline. They had the witnesses. They knew she was lying. But Susan's story kept shifting. evolving, adapting. She couldn't remember if the deadbolt was locked, couldn't remember if she had the gun in her hand already, couldn't remember exactly what Ajike said, but she had perfect memory of feeling threatened, perfect memory of being victimized. The detectives confronted her with the inconsistencies, the neighbors who heard no threats, the timeline that didn't match, the evidence that contradicted her claims, and Susan's response: she still couldn't remember. Selective memory. That's what it was. She remembered every detail that painted her as the victim, but anything that suggested she was the aggressor, suddenly fuzzy, unclear, uncertain. This is what liars do. The truth is consistent. It doesn't change. But when you build a story around lies, you have to remember which version you told, to whom, and eventually, the contradictions pile up. During one particularly revealing moment in the second interview, detectives played back audio from her first 911 call. Susan had said something on that call that contradicted what she was now claiming. When confronted with her own words, she claimed she didn't remember saying it. Her own voice, recorded, played back to her, and she couldn't remember. That's not trauma. That's not confusion. That's someone trying desperately to maintain a narrative that's falling apart under scrutiny. The detectives also pointed out something else. Susan claimed she was terrified, that she thought Ajike was going to kill her, that she was in fear for her life. But on that second 911 call, the one she made after the shooting, Susan wasn't just reporting what happened. She was bad-mouthing the victim, making snide comments, insulting the woman she had just shot. Most people who genuinely fire in self-defense are traumatized. They're shaking. They're in shock. They can barely speak coherently. Susan, she was calm, collected, and more concerned with getting in a few last insults than with the fact that she had just taken a human life. When detectives told Susan she was being charged with manslaughter, she did something that perfectly encapsulated who she was as a person. She refused to go to jail. Like a spoiled child who had never been held accountable for anything in her life, she actually tried to refuse, as if she had a choice, as if she could simply decline and walk away. But this time, there was no escaping, no more calling 911 to make herself the victim, no more hiding behind fear and self-defense. Susan Lorincz was arrested, charged, and eventually convicted. The moment when she tried to refuse arrest reveals the core of who Susan Lorincz is. She is someone who has spent her entire life believing that rules don't apply to her, that consequences are for other people, that she can talk her way out of anything, manipulate any situation, play the victim convincingly enough that someone will rescue her. But not this time. This time, the evidence was too strong. The lies were too obvious. The injustice was too clear. And for once in her life, Susan Lorincz was held accountable. The trial was contentious. Ajike Owens's family and supporters wanted Susan charged with second-degree murder. They argued there was enough evidence of hatred, spite, ill will, but the state attorney explained they couldn't prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, so it was manslaughter, and Susan was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The metal door, the one Susan fired through, became the prosecution's strongest piece of evidence, because here's the thing, Ajike Owens couldn't pose an immediate threat while standing outside a locked, secured door. It's not a crime to knock on someone's door. It's not a crime to yell. Susan was never in danger. She was in control the entire time, and she chose to kill. State Attorney William Gladson made this point crystal clear during the proceedings. He emphasized that for a self-defense claim to be valid, there has to be an immediate, credible threat, someone on the other side of a locked metal door. No matter how angry they are, no matter how loud they're yelling, cannot present that kind of threat. The door was locked. The deadbolt was secure. Susan could have walked away. She could have gone to another room. She could have waited for the police officer she had already called. Instead, she chose violence. She chose finality. She chose to end a human life rather than experience discomfort. After Ajike's death, her family started the Standing in the Gap Fund. Their goal was to provide her 4 children with education, housing, and psychological support. The community rallied. Hundreds of people donated. In the first month, those children lost their mother because a bitter, angry woman decided that her comfort mattered more than someone else's life. Think about what those children experienced. They watched their mother go over to a neighbor's house to defend them. They heard the gunshot. They saw her stumble backward. They watched her die. One of Ajike's sons was standing right there at the door when Susan fired. That bullet could have easily hit him instead, or in addition to his mother. Susan didn't know. She didn't check. She just fired blindly through a door. Those children will carry that trauma for the rest of their lives. They will always wonder if there was something they could have done differently, if they hadn't played so loudly, if they had stayed away from Susan's apartment. And the truth is, none of this was their fault. They were children, being children, living their lives, playing, existing. Susan Lorincz is the one who turned normal childhood behavior into a capital offense. So here's the question this case forces us to confront. What role does race play in situations like this? Would Susan have perceived a white woman knocking on her door as a deadly threat? Would she have pulled the trigger within 20 seconds if the person outside looked like her? We can't know for certain, but the pattern is hard to ignore. The racial slurs, the targeting of the Owens children, the immediate escalation from anger to lethal force. Susan Lorincz saw Ajike Owens as something other than human, something dangerous, something that needed to be eliminated. And that's the real monster in this story. Not the gun, not the locked door, but the hatred that had been festering for years, waiting for an excuse. Research consistently shows that implicit bias affects how people perceive threats. Studies have demonstrated that people are more likely to perceive black individuals as threatening, even in identical situations where white individuals are not perceived that way. Susan Lorincz may not have consciously thought, "I'm shooting this woman because she's black," but her entire pattern of behavior, the slurs, the fixation on the Owens children, specifically, the immediate assumption that Ajike was a lethal threat, all point to racial bias playing a significant role, and Florida's Stand Your Ground law gave her the framework to act on that bias with legal protection, or at least she thought it would. As this story comes to a close, the main mystery is solved. We know what happened. We know why. We know that Susan Lorincz is now behind bars, where she belongs. But here's the haunting question I'll leave you with. How many other Susan Lorincz are out there right now, living in neighborhoods, armed, waiting, researching self-defense laws, convincing themselves that their fear, real or imagined, justifies violence? How many more Ajike Owens will die before we confront the reality that access to firearms doesn't make us safer, it just makes it easier for hatred to become lethal? Susan Lorincz will spend the next 25 years in prison. She'll be 83 years old when she's released. If she lives that long, those years will give her plenty of time to reflect on what she did, on the life she took, on the children she traumatized. But no amount of prison time will bring Ajike Owens back. No sentence will undo the trauma those 4 children experienced. No justice will truly balance the scales. All we can do is learn, recognize the warning signs, understand that hatred doesn't usually announce itself with obvious symbols. Sometimes it wears the face of a concerned neighbor, someone who files noise complaints, someone who calls 911 repeatedly, someone who believes their discomfort justifies any action. Susan Lorincz was a monster, but she was a monster that society created, that laws enabled, that prejudice empowered. And until we confront that reality, there will be more Susan Lorincz, more Ajike Owens, more children watching their parents die over nothing. The door was locked, the threat was manufactured, the hatred was real, and a mother of 4 paid for it with her life. If this story shocked you, disturbed you, or made you question what we accept as normal in our society, then check out the video on your screen right now. I believe it was made for you, because this isn't just about one woman, one neighborhood, one tragedy. It's about all of us and the world we're choosing to create.